This culvert replaced two existing approximately 6 to 8 foot diameter round pipes, and what it was a split channel that came in and was one flow on both of them. And so when we redesigned it, our goal was to replace both of those, both structurally deficient, and then they also were a barrier to fish and other aquatic organisms. We survey several feet, hundreds of feet down upstream and downstream, and we determine a reference reach that is similar to what would be the most natural profile of the stream and have the most natural features that the stream would if this culvert or structure wasn't in here. Then we take that data and then we recreate that through the structure. So that's how you'll see your steps and your weirs, your different boulders, sizes and things like that, your embankment, the width. It's all dependent on all that survey and information that we gather. This one had several steps up through it, and as a natural stream on a large event, those will mobilize and move, and that's the way this design. So while those did move, other boulders and features filled in behind it, so it just kind of recreates itself like a natural stream would. A natural stream will pass debris as well as sediment, but so large trees, and there's some trees here near us right now that started out upstream and moved through during Irene and didn't plug it and didn't do any damage to it. The invert of the pipe, we try to get a natural bottom so that it will accommodate what a aquatic organism would encounter in a natural stream, so they could traverse through the structure.
Culverts that are perched, they're above the water level. Their exit is above the water level. They are long, straight stretches of what's called laminar flow with no breaks and no resting places, and fish and organisms just they can't move in that. Culverts that allowed for the passage of aquatic organisms, meaning that they were large enough, that they were open bottomed, that they had a natural river bottom up through the culvert. Not only were they good for the river, but they tended to fare a whole lot better with the high waters that Irene created. And there were success stories of where culverts put in for other reasons also proved to be flood resilient.
During Tropical Storm Irene, we did not lose any structures that were designed in accordance with the stream simulation method. We lost several structures that were older structures that were just your standard round pipe, and lost several of those, and quite a bit of road damage as a result of those, but we didn't lose any that were designed with this method. We've ranged from probably 20 to 40% increase by going with these, but you increase your service life and you decrease your maintenance.
Overall infrastructure improvement, in terms of upsizing, it's an additional cost up front of 20 to 40%, but taking into consideration the fact that once the culvert washes out, then the infrastructure, the road washes out, and then the repairing of the road would be exponentially higher overall than that 20 to 40% increase that you put towards the increase in the upsize in the culvert initially.
We spend 150% now. That culvert might last for another 20 years or 30 years if it's properly sized. If it's not, we could be in there the next year or in 5 years replacing it at another 150%. So there's a real financial benefit to municipalities and homeowners for driveway access, etc., to put in culverts that are properly sized, or bridges even, which can have a bigger span and allow more flow.
The legislature tasked a couple of state agencies to develop a standard that towns could use that would provide some guidance on how they should design or size a culvert when a culvert needed to be replaced. And the standard in place during Irene required towns to size a culvert to pass a 25-year flood event. VTrans has its own set of standards, towns have their own set of standards, Agency of Natural Resources has their own set of standards. So you can see that folks aren't quite on the same page, but I think one result of Irene is that folks were talking a little bit more about culvert standards and how decisions about how large to size a structure can really have an impact on a community.
We are hoping that the Agency of Natural Resources standards will be upgraded, requiring open bottom, adequately sized culverts, and that the Agency of Transportation will also adopt that, because the standards that the Agency of Transportation adopts drives local standards.
We lost a culvert on Broadbrook Road where we live in Royalton. It was a 3-foot culvert. It probably should be a 12-foot culvert, which may be a difference in $20,000. The damages to that road alone, so one culvert, was $250,000. So we know of probably 20 or 30 culverts at least in the watershed. So you can sort of calculate that out in terms of the impact that fairly small structures make, where the fix is also relatively small to the size of the damages that we saw from Irene. So I bet multiple millions of dollars were seen as a result of undersized structures that failed and took out a road or a house or a town garage or Woodlawn Cemetery here in Rochester. So it's certainly an avoidable flood damage in the future, provided we're willing to make that investment up front.
We need to, as a society in the state, and I hope that that goes from federal, state, town, down to individual landowners, that we will learn from this experience. I realize everybody's rushing around and responding to the emergency situation, but there are right ways that you recover from the storms, and there are wrong ways.
It's been a long-held belief, if you create a larger vessel, it's going to hold more water. And I think people have always wanted to dig the rivers deeper, to straighten them, so that the water stays within the channel and leaves your portion of the valley as quickly as possible. But what happens is that extra depth equates to extra power. A river is powerful by virtue of its slope and its depth. And when we make the river steeper by straightening it, and deeper by dredging or berming it, it becomes more powerful. And that extra power in the river is why we see such tremendous erosion in Vermont after flood.
When we straighten a river, what we do is essentially what you do when you're in your garden and you put your thumb over your garden hose and you increase the scouring ability of it because you're washing your car and you want it to get all that stuff off your car. When we straighten a river channel, that's what we do. We actually increase its erosive capacity. The energy that it has to dissipate becomes stronger.
If you have a meandering river, and that meander begins to work toward the town road or a commercial property, let's say, and you decide to armor that bank, but you're not changing the basic geometry. You're not changing that width, depth, and slope. It may have very little effect on the overall vertical stability of the river. If it's not done properly, what that hard armoring can do is translate the energy that was working on that bank down to the next bank and become a problem for the next landowner downstream. And that's what we've seen, I think, as an issue with bank armoring in Vermont, is we tend to chase the river down valley with rock as one meander migration is stopped and it propagates the next one downstream. Berms have very little effect on the river during these low flow conditions, outside of perhaps affecting how the riparian vegetation interacts with the stream ecosystem. But from a stability standpoint, berms really come into play during those high flow events, when the river actually gets up and would have spilled out onto its floodplain. And it can't access that floodplain because the berm is holding in that high water. You've gone from a situation where perhaps the flood flow would have reached a certain depth and then spilled and maintained that depth, and therefore kept under a certain stream power threshold, to one where now it's contained within the berms and it's got that depth. Again, going back to the two components of stream power, depth and slope. And when you increase the depth during floods, you now create a situation where the bed of the river is going to go out from underneath you. It's going to erode. While berming is a very understandable reaction to floods in Vermont. There should be an analysis of how much and where we do that, so that we aren't translating that power of that flood to other parts of the river system and affecting other riparian landowners.
This is the first bend in the Middlebury River as it comes down from the Middlebury Gorge, and at that bend point it wants to spread out in the landscape and meander and access its floodplain all the time. But because the village is here, we actively manage it. This area of the river wants to be a depositional type of river, and we have modified it to be transport type channel by channelizing it and keeping its energy inside of its banks until it gets downstream of here. During Irene, the Middlebury River jumped its banks downstream of this bridge and flowed down Route 125 for probably about a mile, actually. A large amount of sediment was deposited here during the storm, and people in this particular area were concerned that the storms that were forecast to come would create additional flood damage and because of all the sediment, that we would be more vulnerable to flooding. And so they called the town and asked them to come and remove some of the material. And the town received permission from the Agency of Natural Resources to remove material between the two town bridges. And they did that. And that represents what I would call conventional river management. And it's in large part what's been done periodically in East Middlebury Village to really maintain the river and the village such that we know it today. It became quite controversial because in the legal framework that exists today, wholesale removal of gravel hasn't been done since 1987 when the law changed. And so the environmental community became angry that the river was dredged even though there wasn't any significant damage to town infrastructure or to the adjacent properties.
Gravel removal can create erosion upstream and downstream of a point that actually may end up causing more erosion of the banks as the bed is lowering. And downstream of that point, it may actually end up providing more gravel to the channel because there's additional erosion and materials moving down. So I'm going to extract. And so here's the head cut that has started upstream. And now you can start to see downstream the additional erosion, and you'll see where we extracted that the sediment is starting to build back up in that. But upstream you can see how much faster the water is starting to move and the sediment is starting to erode in that location. And plus I went from a channel that had more gravelly material to now you can see it's filling in with just the fines in that location. You also create much steeper banks in the location that the gravel extraction happens. And they become more susceptible to erosion.
We thought we had laws that were fairly clear that gravel couldn't be taken out of streams, and we had made in the last 20 or 30 years a lot of improvements in the acceptance by the public that just was not a practice that was allowed. Whether people agreed with whether it was the right thing to do or not is a different story, but people had generally accepted you can't dig in the rivers, and if people saw equipment in the rivers, they would usually call somebody and find out what the deal was. When Irene hit, that all kind of went out the window, and partly because of proclamations by the governor of just get in there and dig. So while the Agency of Natural Resources was trying to send a message of no, you need to call us, or don't get in there, or get in there but call us first, the public was getting a lot of conflicting messages about what to do, who to contact, who had the right jurisdiction, who they should listen to, even if they were trying to do the right thing and talking to all the right people. So since then, there's been a widespread recognition, not only by the administration, but also by the public, that something really needed to happen.
In November 2011, the fall after Irene, the legislature, the Natural Resources Committees, and my committee, the Fish, Wildlife, and Water Resources Committee, wanted to know what we had learned whether or not the concerns that were being voiced by so many river advocates